Chapter 27 is about plate tectonics and continental drift. So we have a good amount of evidence for continental drift, and continental drift is where we know that the continents have split apart, and everyone knows the big continent Pangaea that was once here a couple million years ago, couple billion years ago. And this is what we get from there. Evidence from that, a big one, is paleontological evidence, and that is where we see fossils of different plants and animals relating to one another. So for example, in Pangaea, there's South America, Africa, and Antarctica is down here. And there's this fossil called the Glossopteris, and they found this fossil all over the southern part of Africa and South America, and also in Antarctica. And we know that plants, they can't swim, they can't fly, so they would not be able to reach across the spaces of ocean between South America and Africa and South America and Antarctica. It's not possible. Along with another dinosaur called the Lystrosaurus. That one is just this little four-legged creature. It can't swim at all, but we still find its fossil on each one of those places. Another evidence is Paleoclimatic evidence, and that is where we see ancient evidences of old climates, such as tropical or deserts. And we see that amongst Pangaea, the old one, where we have desert going along the band in the middle. We also have wet climate going across the middle, or below that. And we see that through the evidences of rock. Sandstone can tell us that things had a desert climate. Limestone can tell us that it had a wet environment or a shallow marine. Another thing is, I demonstrated right here, is a jigsaw fit. This fits perfectly with one another when you look at its continental crust, because what happened here in between was seafloor spreading, and that is when the ocean gets bigger and bigger, and that is also called a plate boundary that we'll get to in a little bit. But that's just when the ocean, it keeps spreading farther and farther apart with lava coming up. And then lastly, we have structural evidence, just when we see mountains, for instance. We have evidences of old mountains across here, and we still have evidence right here of mountains in Antarctica, and they just connect perfectly if we line them up with their continental crust. All right, then lastly we have Paleomagnetic, and how we see this is that basalt, that lava, it has this thing called magnetite in it. It's very magnetic, and it aligns itself once it cools with the poles that's currently on Earth. And so if we compare the different lava flows of like 250 million years ago, we can see that they all line up in a certain direction. So now we're going to talk about plate boundaries, and this is a really big thing with this chapter. So plate boundaries is what interacts between our continental crust and our oceanic crust. Don't get confused with plate and crust. It is not the same thing, because we can have a plate that is made up of both ocean and continental crust, but yeah, don't get it confused. So we have different kinds of boundaries, and they can either be coming together, which is convergent, or coming apart, which is divergent. And so let's go with the convergent ones first. So let's start off with a continent conversion. An example of this one is India ramming into Asia, and that is where the huge Himalayan mountains are. And that is when you have one plate, continental plate, ramming into another, and you just get these massive mountains, as we can see. Evidence of that is, again, mountains, and we also have earthquakes, but no volcanoes. If you see volcanoes on there, it is not a continent. And actually, the Appalachian Mountains in North America, those are ancient remnants of a continent-continent collision. They've just died down a lot. Next, we have ocean-ocean convergence. An example of this one is Japan, because that is what we call an island arc. This was created by volcanoes, as we know that Japan has, and that's what created these islands. Also, we have huge earthquakes. Again, we know that Japan has humongous earthquakes. What we can see with the actual plate boundary is what we call a trench. And you have one plate, the older continental crust, it's more dense, so it's going to sink down, but it's going underneath the younger one. It's getting subducted underneath, and we have this trench right here, where it's being subducted. So what happens is when the plate is subducted, it goes into the mantle, and then it melts and comes back up. So it melts, comes back up, forming volcanoes. So that is ocean-ocean convergence. Then we have ocean-continent convergence. This is characterized by mountains, volcanoes, and earthquakes. An example of this is the Andes Mountains. The Pacific Ocean is going underneath South America, and while it's going underneath, it's pushing that continental crust together, just kind of smushing it, creating those mountains, along with the Pacific Ocean crust going underneath, it's melting, bubbling up, forming volcanoes. And then again, we also have massive earthquakes down there as well, because you know Chile has had quite a few earthquakes. And that's it for convergent. So then we have divergent boundaries. So with divergent, we have ocean-ocean. And with this, we have volcanic activity and earthquakes. I say volcanic activity because they're not huge volcanoes like we see with the convergent ones. It's more of like it's just kind of seeping up and pushing the ocean apart. Example of this is the mid-ocean ridge in the Atlantic Ocean. They actually have this now on like Google Earth. You can see it right down the middle there, and they also have it in a number of places in the Pacific Ocean as well. And then we have continent-continent divergence. And also we have volcanic activity and earthquakes. Continent-continent divergence can also have bigger volcanoes as well, not like the ocean-ocean, but in the East Africa Rift Valley, that is an example of continent-continent divergence. The sea next to Saudi Arabia, that was once continent-continent divergence, but it's just spread apart so much that the sea has now gotten into it, and now it's a sea. I forget which one it's called. So with that, we also have another thing that we kind of relate, that we go along with plate tectonics, but it's not really one. It's called a hotspot. And a hotspot is like Hawaii. It is when you have a big old mantle plume, and that's just like a huge area of lava that's just sitting right underneath the crust. And as the plate is going over it, it builds volcanoes. And it comes up and erupts and it makes islands. And then as the plate moves, so if it's moving this way, the plate, we have other little islands off to the side here. And that's just like Hawaii, how you have the one big island with a huge volcano and then you have all the other little islands trailing after it. Another example of this is Yellowstone and the whole Snake River Valley. Yellowstone is right now on top of the mantle plume, and that has a lot of volcanic activity. You have the geysers and a lot of hydrologic things. And with that, that is what you need to know about plate tectonics.